Okay, welcome everybody to our first seminar, CRASSH seminar on majoritarianism and caste in India. And I just want to start by saying my name's Manali Desai. I'm in the sociology department, and I'll tell you a little bit about the network and how we've developed this network. So caste as practice is actually a research network that is funded by CRASSH, but it arose from a smaller reading group that we started in sociology with my PhD students and postdocs. And we've been running this for a few months now. The central thread has been to ask why caste persists in every domain of life in India and beyond. Of course, in the diaspora, we can talk about that at some point as well. What explains its tenacity, and why, despite so many other transformations, economic, political, cultural, caste continues to morph and yet remains entrenched? The CRASSH Research Network takes up this question through many different sessions. And just to give you an idea of the upcoming sessions, which I hope you will attend, we've got one on centering Dalit feminist perspectives and one on affective life of hierarchies. Today, we're asking the question of how majoritarianism and caste are connected in India. And we have two very distinguished speakers who, in fact, I think need no introduction, but I will say a few words about them anyway. So we have first Professor Susan Bailey, who will be speaking. She's Professor Emerita of Historical Sociology, Anthropology. Oh dear. Same thing, no. Here at Cambridge, before I get destroyed. She's the author of multiple books, including what's, I think, relevant for us, an outstanding not just an overview, but analysis of the historical evolution of caste, which is in caste, society, and politics in India from the 18th century to the current age, in which the last few chapters actually really bring us up to the present and give us a very good idea of the continuing salience of caste. She's also written other more comparative books recently, including Asian Voices in a Postcolonial Age, Vietnam, India, and Beyond. And her new book, Asian Lives and Anthropological Perspective, Essays on Morality, Achievement, and Modernity is out with Berghahn this year. Is it already out? I don't know if that's correct. Okay. Our next speaker is Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, who absolutely also needs no introduction whatsoever, but I will just say that Christophe is a CNRS Senior Research Fellow at Sciences Po in Paris and the Avanta Chair and Professor of Indian Politics and Sociology at King's India Institute. He is the author of innumerable books. I will name a few: Hindu Nationalism, A Reader, India's Silent Revolution, The Rise of the Lower Caste in North India, and more. Recently, Gujarat under Modi, Laboratory of Today's India, and most recently, I don't know, maybe it's another one after that. Or is that flipped?
Gujarat is the last.
That's the one. Okay, the one before that is Modi's India, Hindu Nationalism, and the Rise of Ethnic Democracy. So I'm just going to explain very quickly the format. Each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, and then I will pose some questions to them that we've kind of developed through our longer term readings. But then we would absolutely like to open the floor to you. We'll have about an hour for questions. We have a lot of people online as well, so we will kind of be going back and forth a little bit. Before we begin, I just want to thank CRASSH for the opportunity to host this event, and especially a shout out to Esther and Nikki for their huge help with all the logistics. And I do want to mention Jasmeet and Priyanka for all the tireless help they have put into making this happen. So over to you, Susan.
So, good afternoon, and Manali, thank you for that very, very generous introduction. I am immensely grateful to have been invited to participate in this terrific initiative, and I hope I can offer something of interest for our session's concerns. I hope, too, that it will be helpful if I try to put issues of caste-derived marginalisation into a wider Asian comparative context. You may know that it was my early work in the 70s and 80s that focused on India. In more recent years, I've been conducting fieldwork in Vietnam around issues to do with the remarkable transformations that Hanoi families have experienced as the country's made its massive shift from high socialism to what's now termed a socialist-oriented market economy. As you know, Vietnam is still a communist-ruled one-party state, so what's also called renovation, doi moi in Vietnamese, is never to be referred to as the embrace of capitalism or the death of socialism. That process of marketization in Vietnam is very much ongoing, with boomingly prosperous cities showing off the fruits of their increasingly showy consumerism. There's a vigorously expansive private sector and also a big state enterprise complex that's much bigger than present-day India's. Vietnam's rates of educational attainment are much higher than India's, and there's particular pride in its high rates of women's participation in the labor force. But where there are instructive parallels with India is in Vietnam's painfully experienced marginalizations, with a widening gulf between haves and left behind have-nots, and considerable public anxiety about those in Vietnam who are poorly placed to benefit from the new make it on your own, thrive and profit ethos, now hailed as a fulfillment of national genius and can-do spirit. Those most likely to be marginalized from Vietnam's high-growth gains are not demarcated from other citizens by anything close to the logic of caste difference. Instead of a population we could easily compare to India's Dalits, those in Vietnam who are likeliest to be poorer and less healthy than other citizens and less well endowed with recognized forms of social and cultural capital are the Hmong, Muong, Tay, Thai, and other groups of uplanders and forest dwellers who are formally classed in Vietnam as ethnic minority peoples. They comprise something like 15% of Vietnam's population, and their perceived separateness is extensively marked and formalized. Ethnic identity in Vietnam is recorded on citizen state ID cards, and the minorities are pushed hard, as their counterparts are in China, to garb themselves in what's defined as their traditional dress and livelihood markers, so as to perform their ethnicity for the entertainment of visitors to their heavily touristified home regions. Some have done quite well out of the commercialization of their artisanal skills and the medicalization of their regional plant and animal products, but they're still often characterized in the way so-called tribals have been in India, as unrefined and childlike little siblings of the homeland's true sons of the soil. Those thought of as Vietnam's true sons, the makers and models of Vietnameseness, are the Viets, the nation's lowlander majority. Clearly then, the non-Viet minorities are comparable in many ways to India's Adivasis, that of course being an Indian category freighted with all kinds of moralizing views and stereotypes, as well as state policy impacts that we clearly need to think about in considering the sources and logic of caste and its contemporary marginalizations, because of the long history of representing Adivasi peoples, as well as Indian Muslims, as civilized caste societies immutably alien other. What I want to suggest is that the marginalizations occurring in present-day Vietnam's marketization era have been both like and unlike what's happened in India since the killing off of Nehruvian quasi-socialism, leading in India, though with many twists and turns, to the entanglements of caste difference, with the inequalities that have been much exacerbated by Hindutva's rise to power, and their interpenetrations with the impacts of what we're now accustomed to calling India's ongoing neoliberalization. Its process is so brilliantly documented by Manali. The questions our panel's asking are tremendously hard to answer, and I certainly don't have any answers to them. Why caste exclusions and inequalities have endured so tenaciously in the post-Nehru era, why its divisions and hierarchies have not retreated to the margins of uncomfortable social memory, like the claims and idioms of class and gender difference, as they were once articulated unapologetically in the Euro-American West. Now, I don't want to overdraw those contrasts, not only because, of course, the realities of class division and everyday sexism still impact so many aspects of life chance outcomes in the West and beyond, but also because all these forms of marginalization have been subjected to vigorous contestation. That's a point I tried to make in my work in the past, my attempts to synthesize historical and anthropological perspectives on caste, the need to take into account things achieved as well as not achieved in India, by the reformist thinkers and movements aimed at derailing the rationales and materialities of caste, without in any way overlooking what those contestations failed to expunge, and in significant cases actually reconstituted and reinforced, that being the violence and oppression that was still so much part and parcel of caste life at the time of my India research. My argument was that in recognizing the power and appeal of India's anti-caste initiatives and doctrines, we're all the more equipped to try to account for its stubbornly enduring life in political and social contexts, most notably in relation to the paradox of ostensibly casteless doctrines and policies having the effect of reifying and perpetuating, rather than expunging, so much of the lived reality of caste. Hence the need to make both the appeal and limitations of Ambedkarism and South Indian non-Brahmanism part of what we deal with in understanding caste today, and also the legacy of the pre-colonial Bhakti devotional traditions, like those of Chaitanya and Kabir, that devalued worldly jati and varna division in favor of unified loving communion with one of the incarnate forms of the Hindu high gods. These are traditions that have both reflected and deflected the logic and marginalizations of caste, most notably those focused on worship of Ram as warrior king. I think that particular Ram heritage is highly relevant to the question of why it's been possible in recent years for the Hindu supremacists' corrosive majoritarianism to leap the barriers that originally restricted its appeal to those of high caste background, a development brilliantly documented by Christophe. I wonder if he would agree that it's that very labile heritage of Ram worship, with its traditions of Bhakti-style inclusiveness, that's helped to attract so many non-elite and lower caste recruits to the Hindutva cause. It's a point I will return to in a moment because I think it bears very much on the question of why the boundedness of caste identities and their associated marginalizations have not softened or dissolved with the rise of the Sangh Parivar and its claims of exclusive and all-embracing Hindu oneness as the basis of Indian nationhood. Yet in the face of that apparent rigidification and enhancement of caste, both before and since the colonial period, I still want to try to argue for an approach that emphasizes caste's open-endedness and fluidity, and the remarkable shape-shifting mutability it's manifested both in past centuries and more recently. That book I wrote about caste was an attempt to deal with caste not as a timelessly traditional structure of predetermined exclusions and stratifications, but as a notably flexible dynamic to be recognized as both a painfully marginalizing force and as a source of self-affirmation and advantage for quite significant groups of people, allowing for mobilization and collective self-assertion, the potential to protect and empower, even as it excludes and subordinates. So I tried to highlight the importance of low-ranking groups who found ways to make real gains, both in the pre-colonial past and more recently, through strategic use of caste idioms and reference points, often turning a loose ancestral connection with certain skills and livelihoods into the means of filling a particular niche in a region's rapidly changing economic order, which in due course came to be hardened up into what came to be seen as an established caste identity. Though it's important to note, I think, that in past centuries, that kind of castification wasn't necessarily the basis for widespread or systematic marginalizations of the kind we associate with caste today. Yet we do need to account for the force of what Dumont called the historic substantialization of caste. And to do so, we need to factor in the key role of state power. That means there's a political story to tell about those processes. What I tried to show in the book was that there's more to be learned about the exercise of state power as a critical force in the shaping and experience of caste than the familiar but problematic claim that caste, as it's been lived and conceptualized in modern times, is an invention of colonialism. Its Orientalist tropes and power knowledge, subjecting a hitherto open, unhierarchical, and uncompartmentalized social order to the effects of the colonizers' alien othering strategies, subsequently inherited and then toxically magnified by the spoils system electoral practices of the post-independence nation state. I tried to tell a more complex and nuanced story, giving emphasis to what it was that the Maratha Peshwas and India's other great post-Mughal state-building rulers found so valuable for the projection of their fragile new claims to power by embracing increasingly formalized caste-based lifestyles. Some of these were very open-ended and based on a lordly ideal of martial power that we now associate with Rajput caste identity and its regional counterparts. Other men of power came to define themselves in high Brahmanical mode, with the effect of laying much of the groundwork for an increasingly rigid divide between people and communities who deemed themselves ritually superior and those they stigmatized as impure or unclean. So I tried to argue for those turbulent pre-colonial political changes to be recognized as the all-important prehistory to the marginalization of what we now know as India's Dalit groups, though recognizing too the ways in which colonial rule magnified and reified what ultimately became so very pervasive as the norms and forms of the untouchability pollution barrier. But it's what I tried to show for the post-independence period that may be particularly relevant to our panel's concerns and also gets us back to Vietnam comparisons. I want to be cautious about drawing parallels between contemporary Vietnam and India. Vietnam's fraught history of anti-colonial and revolutionary upheaval has not produced anything as violent and divisive as what we've been witnessing since the rise of Hindutva as the dominant force in contemporary India's political life. Nevertheless, I think there are points of comparison in relation to matters of national narrative. Among India's varied narrativizations of the nation's life and time were those of the self-consciously modernizing secular reformists, for whom caste figured in both pre- and post-independence versions of the India story as a blot on the national soul that a virtuously self-emancipating new society needed to detoxify and atone for, if not wholly to expunge. But as we know, that well-intentioned thinking generated the schemes of caste-based reparational justice that did so much to reify and perpetuate caste-based divisions and identity markers, thus fertilizing the ground for the entwining of Hindutva ideology with the bitterness generated for people like the Tamil Brahmins of the far south, who've claimed it's they who have suffered intolerable marginalization from the impact of the reservation systems, exclusionary quotas, and entitlement protocols. Important work by Sandhya Fuchs offers further insight into the misfires of present-day reparational justice politics and the very real effects they've had on the way caste is lived and perceived. Fuchs's work with Rajasthan's Meghwal Dalit peoples deals with the workings of a very big piece of India's caste uplift and reparations legislation, which will be familiar to many people in this room, the Scheduled Caste and Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act, and how its operations are rebounding against the people it was intended to protect. Fuchs quotes a typically hostile, high-caste bureaucrat in her field site who spoke of the Meghwal Dalit people as, quote, a legally overprotected community too used to special treatment, dismissing as fake and fraudulent their attempts to use the Act's provisions in cases of caste violence, thus giving voice to her interlocutor's sense of caste as a matter of irreconcilable interests and moral difference. In Vietnam, it's only in much more oblique and subtle ways that one encounters that notion of misentitlement directed at those considered undeserving of state-generated support measures. But in matters of national narrative, the parallels are clearer. The non-Viet ethnic minorities, the forest and upland people, have been very much left out of Vietnam's post-independence telling of the national story as a glorious march through time on the part of stout-hearted patriots, valiantly defending the cherished homeland from rapacious enemy invaders. everyone in Vietnam knows that means not only the defeated enemies of Vietnam's 20th century anti-imperialist liberation wars, the Americans and the French colonial rulers, but also Vietnam's difficult neighbor, China, whose forces every school child learns had to be repeatedly repelled from the homeland's sacred soil in pre-colonial times by the ancient national heroes they are taught to revere, always members of the majority Viet population, never its minority ethnies. And this is remembered very much today in the context of today's maritime island sovereignty conflicts that have long been simmering very dangerously in what Vietnam never refers to as the South China Sea. It's the Eastern Sea when you go to Vietnam, please. Okay. The comparisons with today's Hindutva versions of the India past are very notable. That narrative of nationhood perpetually assailed but always victorious in Vietnam's wars of resistance is the only permissible representation of the Vietnamese national past. And denying Vietnam's ethnic minorities a recognized place in that story has been much to their disadvantage in terms of ideas about their place in the modern nation. By way of contrast, there's been compelling research on the dramatic shift over the last 15 years or so in the ways India's Hindutva history narratives have been adjusted to embrace people of both Adivasi and Dalit identity, including work by Badri Narayan on what he's called the construction of communal memories among North India's Parsis. And that's Parsis, of course, the big UP group traditionally associated with toddy tapping, not Western India's Parsis. Just to be clear that my pronunciation is getting across. Okay. So what Narayan has explored in the recasting of the UP Parsis divinized cult hero Shuladev in today's Hindutva retelling of the region's pre-colonial history, very striking, I think. Shuladev, the hero, has been saffronized as a cow protector and lover of rum, and a valiant fighter in a copycat version of the Ayodhya story. In the past, the famous Dargah of the Sufi Pir Ghazi Mian was a site of warmly inclusive syncretic worship for both Parsis and UP Muslims. In the Sang Paravar account, Narayan tells us, it's the place where ancient Parsis, led by their hero Shuladev, fought and killed the Pir Ghazi Mian, who's now demonized as a despoiler of temples and an enemy of Ram. The effect of this has been not only to add significantly to the BJP vote bank, but as in so many other such cases today, to do so in a way clearly heightening rather than occluding the identities and exclusions of caste in what the narrative conveys and dramatizes. So I do not wish to overrun, and I'm very eager to hear what Christophe is going to tell us and to the discussion to follow. So I'm going to leave it here for now. I hope I've provided a bit of useful food for thought, both comparatively, with an eye to issues of historically informed anthropological context in regard to our panel's questions and concerns.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Manali, and thank you, Jasmine and Priyanka, for giving me this opportunity to indeed revisit, some of my books, in fact, because it's a good opportunity indeed to, following up on what Suzanne has just said, get back to my two main arguments in two of my recent books. In India's Silent Revolution, I argued that the OBC movement in North India was one of the routes for emancipation. The other route, of course, is what I call ethnicization of caste. And that's what we saw in South India mostly, when Dravidianism made the caste divisions less silent. That's one route. By the way, Ambedkar followed more or less that route by converting to Buddhism, because by converting to Buddhism, you escape the caste world and you embark on the ethno-religious ethnicity. You can have ethno-linguistic ethnicity, or you can have ethno-religious ethnicity as one route to emancipation. And the other route is mobilization for reservations, for quota politics. And that worked somewhat well in the 90s, early 2000s. But this momentum was lost for two reasons. One, the one Susan has just mentioned, to react to this rise of the plebeians, subtitle of the book, by the way. The Hindu forces could mobilize Hindus as a whole against this new order that was the Muslim. And all the stories Majoritarian narrates fit in this attempt at saffronizing genealogies of lower castes. That's one reason that worked very well. The other was not the Brahmin or the upper caste anymore. It was the Muslim. And they could, especially by resorting to communal violence, solidify this new vote bank. There is a Hindu vote bank behind the BJP rise to power, and it's a reaction to the rise of the OBCs. There is a dialectic. We have to see this in this sequence. The other reason why the momentum of the Mandal movement was lost had a lot to do with divisions within the OBCs. Now, they could form a bloc so long as they had to fight for something they had in common, reservations. The moment they got reservations, Kurmis, Lodis, Yadavs, Gujars, name one, started to fall apart and started their own parties. Nitish Kumar started his own GDU, well, not GDU in the beginning, but Samta Party in the beginning. When Lalu Prasad Yadav, on the contrary, on the other side, started his own RJP. This is the question I want to revisit. It's not only jatis that is the problem today. It's also class within caste. And it's not easy to ascertain. And in fact, the data I'm going to show you have not been easy to collect. We have done it with Kalai Arasan, my co-author. It's work in progress. We are doing a book on this. In fact, we are doing a book on why do dominant castes like Maratha, Das, Patels are asking for reservations. When you do this research, you have to do this detour. You have to ascertain that there is class within caste, and this is why some of them are asking for reservations.
We can just.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, sorry, so just a second. So,
Okay, so I skip this. These are data coming from the Indian Human Development Survey, something that is very useful because the only source where jatis can be scrutinized statistically. And when they are big jatis, you can use a sample large enough to look at education, revenue, and also jobs. If you look at this, at the two rounds of the Indian Human Development Survey, you see that at face value, well, dominant castes, Marathas in Maharashtra, remain the second richest caste group within Maharashtra. And you see that it's even more significant in Gujarat. Patels are by far the richest caste group in Gujarat. And in Haryana, Jats are not lagging behind by too much. Well, not two Brahmins who have never been very strong in that part of India. Neither Punjab nor Haryana has a strong Brahminical tradition, but forward caste in what? Khatris, Banyas. But that's our number two. So dominant castes seem to remain dominant. Except that if you go to education, jobs, revenues, you realize that they are not investing as much as others in education, number one. Because there is no tradition of education in these landed caste groups. They do agriculture. Why should they go to school? Their capital is not a neutral capital. It's land. So they are educated, but not as much as, for instance, the Malis. Same here. There's being an exception. They are still investing in education, but look, forward caste Brahmins are much more education oriented than the richest group. This is the richest group that is not by far the most educated group. And it will have consequences. That are even less interested in education. And in Haryana, they are lagging behind all the other OBCs, including Gujars. So we have a dominant group that is not investing in education, and that finds translation into something really interesting. Because in sociology, as you know, it's not only the situation now that matters, it's also the trends. And one of the fascinating trends is that the percentage of increase of graduates of dominant caste is much smaller than the same percentage for Dalits, OBCs. OBCs, Dalits. Dalits, OBCs. So, these groups are investing in education, and they may be lagging behind because the starting point is very low, but they're catching up. And I repeat, the trend matters. The dominant caste see the threat mounting, competition coming to their side. This is something, of course, we also find in this very important category that is the salariat. What do you want in India today? A government job. Ironically, 20 plus years after liberalization. Who gets that? Well, Marathas got some of that, but they are not much ahead of Dalits and OBCs. In Gujarat, Dalits are ahead, and OBCs are not lagging behind by far to Patels. And in Haryana, Jats are number 3, after OBCs and SCs. So dominant caste have not invested in education a lot, are seeing those who have coming up and getting the jobs they thought they would get. This reason why this is because they remain Kisans. No. If you remember, when that word became so prevalent under Charan Singh, the Kisan is this beloved capitalist. That's what the Rodolphs told us. When you do agriculture, you certainly do not need education, or you think you do not need education. You do not go to the bureaucracy of the public sector as much as others. And at the end of the day, the result is that you earn less. But this is a fascinating table. Till we did it, I could not really ascertain that. You look at the bottom 60% of the dominant caste, and you realize that they earn less than the Dalits and the OBCs in Maharashtra, less than the Dalits and the OBCs in Gujarat, and less than the Dalits, less than the OBCs in Haryana. the bottom 60%. What does it mean? It means that if you look at quintiles, you divide your caste group by 5 according to the level of revenue. The bottom quintile is so large. This is the pyramid. What does it mean? It means that if you connect to the previous table, you have a very large number of poor people within the dominant castes. A huge percentage, more than half. So Dalits have got caught up, OBCs have caught up, and that's why they need reservations. Because if they don't get what others got, they'll be the losers. Well, that was a challenge, definitely a challenge for the Modi government, because that was the support base of BJP after Mandal. I repeat, after Mandal, you had this moment of, I would say, unity among OBCs, and one caste joined the other castes. We saw the Marathas, the Patels, the Jats, the Lingayats, the Kamas, the Redis, voting BJP, along with Brahmins, Banya, Rajputs. So if these groups were not happy with the new dispensation, they could have seceded from this bloc. What was the solution? Well, more Hindutva, of course. And it worked pretty well because of the syncretization process that was already working with the Dalits. More strategic distribution of tickets. We did a special issue of contemporary South Asia with Gilles Vernier's, where we show that in the Indie Belt, BJP was very good at giving tickets to non-dominant OBCs. Yadavs did not get any ticket from BJP. They gave to other OBCs, and it worked pretty well. By the way, this is exactly what the Samaritans Party has done this year. They have beaten them at their own game. And thirdly, they did the reservation, 10% for the economic weaker sections, and that was for this. And it diffused the mobilization we saw in 2017, 2018, 2016, 2017, 2018. You have Hardik Patel in Gujarat. You have, in each of these states, you had people fighting for reservations. They got it in the garb of this EWS, economic weaker sections, 10% quota. But it's completely transforming the philosophy of reservations in India, as so many colleagues have shown in India. Now I turn to the last point. Yes, reservations, but how many jobs? And in the title of today's session, there is this question of marginalisation. Well, reservations play a more and more marginal role. First of all, because you have this erosion of public sector. Not only you have an erosion of the number of jobs, but you have also a rise of vacancies. And more than that, you retain the same percentage of jobs, and they represent, of course, as a result of privatization, less and less job in practice. This is something that affects Dalits as much as OBCs. This data come from, I can't read this, so I have to look at it, no problem. This is in the central government services. Central government services means the bureaucracy. And we'll turn to the public sector after that, because more jobs in the public sector, but still the same problem. Well, if you look at that, it's very interesting. The percentage of Dalits benefiting from these jobs has remained the same. Of course, you don't change the percentage of the jobs into the quota, 16, 17% by and large. But in terms of numbers, from 5.4 lakhs to 5.2 lakhs, to 5 lakhs, 5.1, 4.4, 4.8, 4.9, and at the end you have 4.5 lakhs, you've lost 1 lakh jobs with the same percentage. That's for the period before Modi. Everything started before Modi, in Gujarat in particular, but not only. If you turn to the public sector enterprises, you have larger numbers, and you have the same phenomenon. The percentage remains the same, even it increases. But in terms of numbers, you have also this decline from 16.30 lakhs, you end up with 14.80 lakhs. It's not the same situation on the OBC side. Why? Because Mandal starts, it takes a long time for Mandal to be 27%. At the end, you have 27%, even more than that, and more jobs. And this is what has changed under Modi. If you look at the last data, and here this is for the central government service, you see that I'm surprised some slides are missing. I should have sent you another file. Yeah, let me finish it.
Sorry.
Yeah, because sorry about that. But I sent you something that is not up to date, foolishly.
I think.
Yeah, thank you. I will give you the latest data, because we have better data than that. Yes. Let's find out. Yeah. Yeah. Why don't we try to show this one? I can give you the figures. Of course, it's easier to show, but I can give you the figures. We have. It's a very significant drop.
Est-ce qu'on va connecter le...
Yeah, I can put that on my pen drive. And sorry for that, but I would like to take only 1 minute for giving you the last data, because they are really significant. They are really, quote unquote, after reservations, and these are their own figures. So
I'm not sure about Christophe, because this is the only one I have, and it's been used.
Okay, so let me say it. No problem. Let me give you the result. It's not a problem. If you look at the central government services in India as on 2022, so this is really the most recent figures we have. The percentage of Dalits there remains around 17%. But in 2018-19, we had more than 569,000 Dalits benefiting from that. 500,000, more than 500,000. 4 years later, after a drop that is really dramatic, 318,000, from 560,000 to 318,000. Constant diminution of the number of jobs reserved for Dalits in the bureaucracy. OBCs are in a very similar situation. same percentage, from 700,000 to 400,000. Can you imagine? So what does it say? It says that not only upper caste are benefiting from EWS quotas, but because of privatization and because of the reduction of the jobs in the bureaucracy, two things are going together. Reservations will not be, I would say, a solution for social upward mobility. And there is a realization of this that has diffused the anger of Dalits for decades. That has also been responsible for creating a Dalit bourgeoisie. Mahars in Maharashtra, Tatars in Uttar Pradesh are very good examples of this kind of socioeconomic differentiation. If that goes, and that's my last word, a caste census will be very popular. But if there is one motto that can bring together all these people, it's caste census. Because a caste census, it's a bit like Mandal in 1989. Everybody wants one. The moment they get it, they'll divide again. They'll get divided again. Like Mandal, they want to know. And I'm pretty sure that it will become a major argument on the Indian political scene for these reasons. Because there is this kind of decline. And of course, there'll be politicians for taking up these issues. I stop here, and I hope we'll have